Welcome to part 5 of my Campervan conversion series. In this video I'll be insulating my 2020 Peugeot Expert. For this we'll be using a tape measure and pen to take our measurements, 10mm thick thermoacoustic insulation, a roll of thin Reflectix, adhesive spray, 3 rolls of Evo fleece from Dodo, and a roll of aluminium foil to cover the seams in between the insulation, as well as a pair of scissors. I started by installing the 10mm insulation inside the sliding doors of the van. This wasn't a difficult job, but it was time consuming, as the doors went surprisingly far back and the space was quite tight, particularly behind the door handles. I used the tape measure as much as possible, but had to go by feeling in the deeper sections. Once all the 10mm insulation had been installed in the door and the seams between the pieces had been covered with aluminium tape, I moved on to the section above the wheel arches. I cut the wires free so there'd be more space to work, and cleaned out the dust so the insulation would stick well. And continued with the thermoacoustic insulation. I did this part of the insulation over the course of a few days, and was surprised by how much it continued to reduce the road noise with each section. I removed the trim so I could cover as much of the walls as possible. Most of it was secured with expansion clips, but there were 2 or 3 screws that had to be undone with a screwdriver. The next step was installing the thinner Reflectix. I used this on the walls of the van where there'd be less space, to make room for the Evo fleece that would come later, with my goal being to cover as much of the van's walls as possible. After removing another piece of trim, I held the insulation up to the wall and made some rough markings, as this part of the job doesn't need to be too precise. I used adhesive spray on both the wall and the Reflectix, waiting about 30 seconds so the adhesive had time to go tacky before sticking the pieces down. Here's what it looked like when all of the Reflectix had been installed. I made sure to leave enough exposed metal for when we do the carpet lining later on. Where they meet will be covered by the ply lining, so it doesn't have to be too neat. Once that was done, I went back to using the 10mm insulation, filling in the back doors where my sister worked on the inside of the van. The last parts of the van that I used the 10mm insulation on was on the upper sections of the side and back doors. Here's the van with all the Reflectix stuck down. I used aluminium tape to cover the seams where the thick and thin pieces met, as well as on the upper sections of the doors, so there'd be a smoother surface for the carpet lining. These edges will end up being covered when we reinstall the wooden panelling, so it doesn't need to be perfect. Before we could install the fleece, I needed to run the wires for the roof lights. For this I used 22 gauge wire to match the LED hub I ordered online, as well as wire cutters and a metal coat hanger which I'll be using to fish the wires out of the wall. The original plan was to go through this side panel up to the centre beam in the roof. But after drilling through 2 layers of metal and then finding a third, I realised it would be much easier to follow the wires to the rear brake lights, which made much more sense. I began by dropping the wire through an access point above the rear doors, and worked my way back to the centre beam on the side that I'll be installing my battery on in the future. I made sure to leave a lot of spare wire so there'd be enough to use later on when we install the lights. Once everything was in place, I used wire tape to protect and secure the wire. I wrapped the wire in the places where it would be in contact with the metal edges of the van's walls, which will prevent it from getting damaged by vibrations as the van's moving. Then I secured it to the pre-existing wires so it wouldn't be loose. For this section in the pillar of the van, I made sure there's plenty of slack so the wire wouldn't be pulled tight over any sharp edges. Here's what it looked like when it was done. The last and final step was installing the Evo fleece. I chose it because it's safe to handle and it doesn't hold moisture so it won't go mouldy, and it's also quite affordable. The fleece has two different sides, with one fluffy edge and one being flat, which makes that side easier to use with adhesive spray. I started by filling up the space above the wheel arches, as well as the smaller recessed sections of the van's walls, and I used the coat hanger again to push the fleece through the sections that I couldn't reach. Once the space above the wheel arch was full, I used adhesive spray to secure the fleece to the wall, which would be covered up later on by the wooden panelling. I used a lot of small pieces in that first section, but realised later on that folding the wool over for the largest spaces saved time and created less waste. Once that first section was done, it was time to put the first piece of wood panelling back on the wall. I used the expansion clips that I saved in part 1 of the series, when we sound deadened the van. After that, we continued filling in the gaps in the van's walls. This was the quickest and easiest stage of insulating the van, and we used 3 complete rolls of the Dodo fleece. Here's the van once the walls are fully insulated. You can find a link in the description to a full item list as well as written instructions.